Welcome to our deep dive, you guys, into James Joyce's Ulysses. Today we're going to be working with excerpts from the Oxford World's Classics edition, and trust me, you are in for a treat.
You know, Ulysses is really something special in the way that it manages to capture a single day, June 16th, 1904, in such intricate detail. And really every fleeting thought and like a chance encounter on the street, or even just these small moments.
It really is quite a feat.
It's like Joyce took a magnifying glass to Dublin, just examining every little thing.
Yeah, fascinating. So let's jump right into that opening scene. We meet Buck Mulligan, a pretty flamboyant character who makes a pretty theatrical entrance, holding a mirror and kind of playfully mocking his companion, Stephen Dedalus. He calls him a dreadful bard.
Yeah, and you notice right away there's this tension below the surface of their humorous banter.
Right.
Like Mulligan teases Stephen about his aunt's plain-looking servants.
Right.
And he says, lead him not into temptation. It's like a subtle jab at Stephen's piety, and it hints at the complex power dynamic between them.
Really interesting. Then we shift to Stephen's internal world. He catches his reflection in the mirror, hair on end, and asks this really profound question: who chose this face for me? It's like he's wrestling with, his identity and how he's perceived by everyone else.
Yeah, and that question's really key for understanding Stephen.
Okay.
It reveals his existential angst and, his self-consciousness and this struggle to sort of reconcile his intellectual aspirations with his physical appearance.
So now get ready for a hard left turn. Joyce takes us to a totally different scene. It's bursting with this youthful energy, young shouts of moneyed voices in Clive Kempthorpe's rooms. There are pale faces collapsing with laughter and a chaotic chase with a young man with slit ribbons of his shirt whipping the air. And then, oh my gosh, this image appears. A scared calf's face, gilded with marmalade.
Yeah, that image, that totally unexpected image, really showcases how Joyce masters language.
Right.
And how he puts humor into these everyday situations.
Yeah.
Think about it. He took a normal breakfast and made it bizarre and memorable.
Unforgettable.
With one detail, one surreal detail.
The marmalade. I know. It's so strange and specific, but it works.
It does.
So let's go back to Stephen. He's having breakfast with Buck Mulligan and Hames, who is their English guest, and they're out of milk, and the milkwoman arrives. And Mulligan just insists on speaking Irish to her, even though she doesn't understand. It's a little awkward.
Yeah, that interaction speaks volumes about the climate in early 20th century Ireland.
Oh, really?
Mulligan's insistence on speaking Irish, even though the milkwoman is uncomfortable, can be seen as like a cultural assertion, in a colonized nation that's dealing with its identity. It's subtle, but it's powerful.
Yeah, that's a good point. Joyce introduces themes of language and nationalism and power dynamics.
Exactly.
Wow. So later on, Buck Mulligan tells us about Stephen's theory about Shakespeare's Hamlet. Yeah. Apparently, Stephen's trying to prove that Hamlet's grandson is Shakespeare's grandfather and that he himself is the ghost of his own father. That's a lot.
Well, this is Joyce's playful side coming through in literary interpretation.
Yep.
He's making fun of those who over-intellectualize literature.
Oh.
But he's also foreshadowing Stephen's struggles with fatherhood and legacy. Stephen is haunted by the ghost of his mother throughout the book.
Yeah, okay, so we then see Stephen in the classroom teaching. He takes a line from Milton's Lycidas. For Lycidas, your sorrow is not dead.
Right.
And uses it to launch into a philosophical discussion about movement and actuality.
This is Joyce's unique style.
Yeah.
Weaving together literature and philosophy and everyday life.
Yeah.
Stephen's mind is constantly making these connections between ideas and experiences, reflecting how complex thought is.
Yeah, absolutely. And then he drops this line, thought is the thought of thought. It's just so Stephen,
it is.
Intensely introspective and preoccupied with the nature of thought. But just as we're getting lost in his philosophical musings, we're snapped back to reality when Mr. Deasy, Stephen's employer, enters.
Yes, Mr. Deasy, with his anti-Semitic views, is a harsh reality check.
Oh, yeah.
He goes on about England being in the hands of the Jews.
Right.
And while it's disturbing, it's super important for understanding the book's context. It also sets the stage for Stephen's thoughts about Shylock later on.
From Merchant of Venice.
Yeah, prompting us to consider how prejudice shapes us.
Wow. So now let's introduce our other main character, Leopold Bloom. And he seems like a world away from Stephen.
Definitely.
We first meet him, and he's lost in thought, just strolling through Dublin, taking in the sights and sounds and smells of everyday life.
The contrast between Stephen's brooding and Bloom's everyday concerns is intentional.
I see.
They're two very different ways to experience the world,
Okay.
which makes their eventual meeting even more interesting.
Right. Bloom is fascinated by the little things.
Yeah.
At one point, he's totally engrossed in figuring out how much he'd need to pay for 10 barrels of something.
Right.
Then he walks past a school, hears kids reciting the alphabet, and then his mind jumps to a list of Irish islands. Inish Turk, Inish Shark, Inish Boffin.
His mind's like a pinball machine.
It is bouncing all over the place. And of course, he stops at the butcher shop and stares at the sausages and polonies. Food is a big deal for Bloom.
Well, Bloom's stream of consciousness is fascinating because it's so relatable.
Yeah.
He's not some intellectual. He's a normal guy with normal worries and desires and a mind that wanders. It makes him the heart of the book.
Right.
Someone we can connect with, even in Joyce's prose.
I like that. And speaking of everyday life, we find Bloom going to a funeral. Patty Dignam's funeral. It's somber, but Bloom's mind, well, it doesn't really stop wandering.
Even with death, Bloom's thoughts go to these small details, the procession burial customs, and even the meaning of life and death.
That's interesting.
Yeah, this mix of the profound and the everyday is Joyce's signature, and it shows how Bloom processes the world around him.
Yeah. For example, he sees the grave diggers getting the grave ready and thinks, first thing strikes anybody, bury the dead.
Right.
Then he gets into this debate about if Robinson Crusoe's Friday would have buried him if he had died. It's such a Bloom thought.
It is. It shows Bloom, even at a funeral, is constantly looking for connections in unexpected places.
Curious and empathetic.
Exactly. It shows his intellectual curiosity in finding meaning in the small things. Now let's move on to Bloom's work life.
Yeah, after the funeral, we find Bloom at a newspaper office trying to get an ad placed. And of course, his mind is racing with ideas. He gets a concept for a music tour, pictures, shapely bathers on Golden Strand for a photograph, even imagines all the questions he'd answer in an advice column.
This shows Bloom's entrepreneurial side and his fascination with how media shapes opinions.
Ah.
He sees the newspaper as this tiny version of society reflecting everyone's interests and concerns and desires. And it sort of foreshadows the rise of mass media.
Yeah, that's a good point. And after work, Bloom has all these encounters on the streets of Dublin. He runs into Mrs. Breen, who's gossiping about someone's illness. He helps a blind guy cross the street and even sees Blazes Boylan, a character who will be important later.
These random encounters are Joyce's way of showing how our lives are connected. And the social fabric of Dublin Bloom in his wanderings becomes like this silent observer of all these things that make up the human experience.
That's beautiful. Then Bloom stops for lunch at the Burton restaurant, and it's like reading a food blog from 100 years ago. He's watching the other people eating and thinking about food and appetites.
Bloom's focus on food and his observations really highlight how much he's engaged with the physical world. He experiences life through all his senses,
Right.
savoring every moment. It reminds us to be present in our everyday lives and appreciate sensory experiences.
Yeah, he has this whole thing about poisonous berries and people eating eggs 50 years old, blue and green again.
Right.
He even gets an idea for a poison mystery from people's eating habits. It's his imagination taking over.
It is fascinating, isn't it? He goes from food to the mysteries of life and death. It's this finding the extraordinary in the ordinary that makes him so compelling. But let's leave Bloom and his poison mystery and follow the music to the Ormond Hotel.
At the Ormond Hotel, we find Simon Dedalus, Stephen's father, singing Bloom. Bloom is captivated by it, lost in thought about lost love and the power of the voice. It's beautiful and reminds us that music can connect us to our feelings.
Music is vital in Ulysses.
Yeah.
It triggers memories and emotions. Bloom's reaction to Simon's singing shows his sensitivity and his longing for connection, reminding us that music is universal. But as the music fades, we're on the edge of a very different experience.
We are about to enter the infamous Nighttown episode. Get ready for a wild ride. Okay, so we're going into Nighttown, also known as Circe in Ulysses. And I hear this is where Joyce really gets experimental.
Yeah, Nighttown or Circe. It's like a fantastical dreamscape, this hallucinatory trip into Bloom and Stephen's subconscious desires and fears.
Okay.
Get ready for talking animals, bizarre transformations, and a blurring of reality and fantasy.
Sounds wild. In the excerpts, I saw things like Bloom on trial by people from his past, and then he's forced to wear corsets and petticoats.
Yeah, and those scenes, while funny, explore complex themes. Bloom's trial, for instance. It explores anxieties about masculinity and societal expectations.
I see.
His guilt, his desires, and the power dynamics between men and women back then.
And what about when he's crowned the King of Ireland with fireworks and a coronation?
Well, that's a glimpse into Bloom's desire for recognition and power, right? A little escape from his everyday life.
Right.
But it falls apart quickly showing the vulnerability and insecurity that haunts him.
So even in fantasy, there's realism and depth. What about Stephen? What happens to him in Nighttown?
Stephen's journey is just as bizarre and revealing. At one point, he smashes the chandelier with his ash plant and shouts, "Non serviam."
You said that means I will not serve in Latin, right?
Exactly. It's a powerful statement.
What does it mean, though?
Well, Stephen's non serviam is a lot of things. It's rejecting authority, both religious and societal.
Okay.
He won't conform. He's asserting his independence as an artist. It speaks to rebellion and forging your own path.
But in all this Nighttown chaos, something amazing happens. Bloom and Stephen connect. They leave that surreal world together and have this touching conversation.
Yet, their encounter, despite all the weirdness, is a turning point in their relationship.
Okay.
It's the start of this father-son thing between these lost souls who find comfort in each other.
So even with fantasy and subconscious desires, there's human connection and finding meaning in unexpected places. What happens after they leave?
Well, Bloom, being kind and maybe feeling responsible, takes Stephen home for cocoa.
Ah.
They talk about music literature families revealing more about themselves and their different views on life.
Sounds like a quiet moment after that wild ride. What does it tell us about them?
Well, it shows both the contrasts and similarities between them.
How so?
Different backgrounds, different interests, but they find common ground. It reminds us that connection can happen between anyone, no matter how different.
I like that. And then do they stay together?
No, their paths split after that night.
Oh.
Stephen goes off into the unknown, the artist searching for his place. Bloom goes back home to the familiar. Their connection was real, but they go in different directions.
It's interesting how Joyce uses that to show the different paths we take in life. And now I think we need to talk about the end of Ulysses, Molly Bloom's soliloquy.
Ah, yes. Molly's soliloquy. It's stream of consciousness at its best, raw and unfiltered. It's the perfect ending for a book about the human experience.
I'll admit it was hard to read pages and pages of her thoughts in bed. She thinks about past lovers, Bloom, her daughter Millie, her ups and downs, her desires and regrets. It's overwhelming.
Molly's voice, unfiltered and free, is so different from Stephen and Bloom.
Right.
It reminds us that even in a complex book like Ulysses, there's room for simple, everyday experiences, especially those of women, which were often ignored back then.
And the book ends with one word.
Yes.
What's that about?
It's open to interpretation.
Okay.
It could be affirming life, accepting the past, surrendering to desire, or maybe hope. It's ambiguous and makes you think long after you're done reading.
Like Joyce is leaving us with a question, a sense of wonder about life. But before we get too deep into that, let's step back. What stood out to you in Ulysses? Wow, so much has happened in just one day in Dublin. What really stands out to you from our deep dive into Ulysses?
You know, for me, it's Bloom's essential goodness.
Okay.
Think about it. In a world that's so cynical, he stays compassionate and empathetic.
Yeah.
He sees good in everyone, even when they're awful. I think that's powerful, especially given what was happening in Dublin back then.
I totally agree. Bloom's humanity just shines through in all that complexity. And something else that struck me was Joyce's mastery of language.
Oh, yeah?
Like he plays with words, invents new ones, blends languages, throws in these allusions to literature, history, mythology.
Yeah, his skill with language is amazing.
It is.
He makes you, as a reader, pay attention to every single word and phrase, every little thing.
Right.
It's like he's showing us that language itself is alive and has so many possibilities.
Yeah, I'll admit there were times when I felt lost, especially in Molly's soliloquy, but then suddenly there'd be this flash of insight.
Yeah, those moments are so rewarding.
They are.
It's like you're struggling through this thick forest, and then suddenly you're in a clearing and you see everything so clearly.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
So we've hung out with Buck Mulligan's wit, Stephen's angst, Bloom's humanity, and Molly's earthiness. We have explored Dublin, debated Shakespeare, and even went to surreal Nighttown. What does it all mean?
Yeah.
What should we take away from this deep dive?
Oh, that's the best part about Ulysses, isn't it?
What is that?
There's no one right answer. It's a book that makes you think critically and feel deeply and question everything.
Yeah, it's not a passive read. But even with all that complexity, there's this underlying humanity that peeks through.
For sure.
Joyce captures the human experience from the everyday stuff to the big stuff with incredible detail.
Exactly. Ulysses isn't just about one day in Dublin. It's about the human condition itself.
Okay.
It's about looking for meaning, struggling to connect the joys and sorrows of just existing.
And maybe it's about accepting all of it.
Right, the ups and downs,
Yeah.
the messy reality of being human.
And saying yes to it all.
Exactly. You know, we've talked a lot about Bloom and Stephen and Molly and everything that happens on June 16th, 1904.
Right.
But there's one character we haven't mentioned much who's really important. Dublin itself.
Oh, yeah.
The city isn't just background. It shapes the characters and what happens to them.
That's a great point.
So think about this. How does Joyce use Dublin to show what Ireland was like back then, socially, politically, culturally?
That's something I'm definitely going to think about. And if you're intrigued by all this, I really encourage you to read the whole book.
You should.
There's just so much more to discover, so many layers to peel back, and so many brilliant moments waiting for you. Until our next deep dive, happy reading.